Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. It's always twice you have to say good morning or good afternoon to get a response, I find, from audiences. It's been a fantastic day today. I mean, a real variety of themes and topics that we've been touching on. But we really want to come on now to a panel around how we unleash the potential of the Oxford-Cambridge Arc. I've got a great panel here. We'll come to some introductions in a second. For those of you I've not met, my name's Andy Neely. I'm the Senior Pro Vice-Chancellor at the University of Cambridge with responsibility for enterprise and business relations. So that's basically everything to do with innovation, commercialization, startups, spin-outs and links with business. And I thought it was worth just starting with a few comments about actually how fantastic the Oxford-Cambridge region is. So if you think about just the regional economy already, we've got a regional economy that accounts for 7.1% of England's economic output, measured by GVA. We've got a regional economy that supports over 2 million jobs. We've got a regional economy that's doubled over the last decades, or last 2 decades. So in 2000, it delivered 58 billion to the UK economy. It's now estimated that it's risen to about 125 billion. So an incredibly successful regional economy. It's also got really healthy foundations in all sorts of ways. I mean, as you go across this region and look at some of the firms that are based there, the large firms, the startups, some of the innovative technologies, it's absolutely fantastic. I come from the university sector. We've got a really rich and diverse set of universities across our region, both focusing in some cases on training highly skilled people that we need, but also some real research powerhouses internationally. We did an economic analysis of Cambridge University recently, and in my institution, or Cambridge University, we contributed in 2020-21 about 30 billion, or enabled 30 billion to be created in the UK economy, supported 86,000 jobs across the country. It's not just locally in the immediate region, but across the UK. And for me, the most important figure actually in that report was that something like 80% of that 30 billion comes from startups and spin-outs that are associated with the university. So we often think of universities as really important places for education and for research. Those are absolutely core missions. But that whole innovation economy and the startup and spin-out contribution we make is incredibly important. That's just one set of anchor institutions across the region. We can look at the capital, we can look at the skills, we can look at the talent that's coming in. And if you look to the future, there are some predictions around how bright the future is for the Oxford-Cambridge regional area. So Bidwell's estimate that the Oxford-Cambridge regional economy has the capacity to deliver 235 billion annually by 2030 if growth is sufficiently provided for. And that's really the question we want to come to today, is the question of how do we unleash that economic potential of this region that makes a massive difference to the UK. We've got a great panel. What I'm going to do is ask the panel members to introduce themselves, but rather than just saying their roles, I'm going to ask them to say a little bit about their backgrounds, just so you know where they're coming from as they start to answer the questions. So Neelam, if we can start with you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here today. So I'm Neelam Patel, Chief Exec of a health and life science cluster organisation called MedCity. I'm also a board member of the UK Health Research Authority and have also advised on the Institute of Digital Molecular Technologies at the University of Cambridge, which I know Andy also has supported. So I've been Chief Exec of MedCity for about 4 years. Actually, it is my last week and my last event for MedCity, so it's particularly memorable. I joined MedCity with a research background and an industry background. So much of my career has been in the global pharmaceutical industry, and joined the private sector as a secondee to the National Institute of Health Research. A common thread to that career has been how we can bring more industry research and collaboration into the UK. And this is something I felt very strongly on as I led the research portfolio for Lilly latterly, and realised that actually the UK wasn't as competitive as some of our other countries that we worked in. Joining the NIHR, I realised actually that there was work to be done, and having commercial experience and an industry collaboration and a viewpoint as to how the public sector could operate was clearly an advantage. So it was a joy to join MedCity, where as a London-based organisation and founded by the London universities, the Academic Health Science Centres and the Mayor of London, our mission was to grow the economy and improve health outcomes of the communities that lived and worked there, predominantly by enabling the organisations to collaborate and work together, which really, as we've heard this morning, is a defining point of a cluster. So today, I bring a London hat on, but I'd like to have London to be included as part of the Oxford-Cambridge arc, because really together we are much stronger. And of course, I will continue to wear my industry hat as well, because collaboration is so important cross-sector.
Great, thank you, Neelam. We'll come back, I'm sure, to that collaboration point. Dr. Andy Williams.
So thank you, Sir Andy Williams. I'm chair of the newly formed Oxford-Cambridge Supercluster Board, which is a collaboration or a coalition, depending on how you want to think of it, between the large businesses across the whole of Oxford and Cambridge and all the areas in between, university groups, local enterprise partnerships and investors. And it's really looking at how we maximise the opportunity of the Oxcam arc for the UK economy, which is part of the answer to the study. It's not just about Oxcam arc, it's about the whole of the wider UK economy. So I guess my background, going back a long time, I didn't think I was going to get asked about that, Andy. 30 years ago, I was doing phage display of antibodies for a company called Cambridge Antibody Technology, in vitro antibodies as the basis for many, actually I think a majority of the best-selling top 10 drugs in the world now. And that all came out of technology that came out of LMB, the University of Cambridge 30 years ago. I was the 23rd employee of Cambridge Antibody Technology, and then became the umpteenth employee of AstraZeneca several years later, and I actually oversaw the move of AstraZeneca into the Cambridge area. So I've both seen the advantages of bringing a large organisation into an established cluster, and actually, frankly, the growing pains of doing such a thing as well. So I'm very happy to talk about what's worked well, what needs to change, and how we evolved from what was quite a small life science cluster when I joined it 30 years ago, which is a cluster now of, numbers better than me, probably 700 life science companies just in Cambridge, a similar number in Oxford, which we hopefully will be able to bring together through the infrastructure that's coming our way.
Great, thank you. Richard Hutchins.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. I've spent the last 20 years working in the West Midlands, working with the University of Warwick, with Warwick Manufacturing Group, Jaguar Land Rover, working on R&D programs, set up an inward investment agency in the West Midlands. So, much of my experience is drawn from the West Midlands and the wider Midlands. But I was lucky enough to be selected last month to be the first MD of the Oxford to Cambridge partnership. So I'm very much here in listening mode, happy to share any thoughts as we go through the panel discussion. But yeah, it's great to be in post and to learn about this fantastic region.
And I think this is day 28 of Richard, so he has complete mastery of the entire region there.
So we could ask you lots of questions.
And then delighted to be joined by Sir John Peace as well.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. And I hope no one's going to ask any questions like the last presenter. Otherwise, my colleagues on the panel will take those very professionally. I'm John Peace. I'm here on this panel to talk about my experience with the Midlands Engine, but perhaps to understand why I took on the role of chair of the Midlands Engine and Midlands Connect, which is the transport body. Let me tell you a little bit, if I may, about my background. And my background is I started a technology business many years ago. That business was called Experian, and today is one of the largest information technology businesses in the world. And I grew it from a small business to a large business. In the very early days, I couldn't afford to bring in McKinsey or anyone like that to write business plans. Along the way, I worked with a few universities, but by and large, it was about growing the business, and that took precedent over any other thinking that we might be doing. Having grown that successfully, I was then also invited to take over a large corporation, one of the largest retail corporations in Europe at the time, and I had to restructure it, and I got used to dealing with grumpy people and difficult situations and sorting them out. And inside that group, there was a small little luxury fashion business, which we were talking about earlier, called Burberry. And everyone was telling me, this is terrible, this business is going nowhere, you should sell it for a few £100,000. It's today one of the largest, most successful luxury brands in the world. And it's a question of having the right leadership and the right vision to actually make that asset work for the shareholders and indeed for our country. It's a quintessentially British brand. Having done that, I also then took over the chairmanship of Standard Chartered Bank, which is one of the largest trade banks in the world. And that took me around the world many times, over to Asia, to Africa, as well as in North America and South America. And as a trade bank, we went through the last financial crisis. And indeed, in my office in London, next to me for about 2-3 months, I had many of the Treasury team and Gordon Brown team working on how to recapitalize banks, because what happened in a crisis, often the rule books go out of the window because what you're doing, and we were close to Armageddon at weekends there. It was very important to think different. And do you know what? I think we're probably at a similar point now to start thinking different. So then why am I here on this panel having taken over as the chairman of the Midlands Engine? The simple reason is I've had a very successful business career. I'm not a politician. I have no interest in politics, although I think there are some good politicians and some not so good politicians. But the reality is, I thought it was time to do some public service. I'd never done that along the way in my career. I'd learned many things, and what I've been trying to do is, over the last 7 years since taking on that role, is use some of the knowledge and experience that I've gained in terms of business and other things I've done geographically, different markets around the world, to help the Midlands as a region, which is the second largest economic area outside of London, and is about 800,000 businesses. And that's been quite a challenge. I know it doesn't exist in the Arc, but it's quite a patchwork quilt in the East and the West. And there's some rivalry, as you well know, between the East and the West. And I often used to have to challenge local politicians to tell me, where's the border? Can you just show me where the West starts and the East starts? I'm delighted to say we've come a long way. And I think in the discussion this afternoon, the word collaboration and the need for collaboration and working together is going to come up many times. And if I learned anything out of that last financial crisis, if you don't work together, if you don't think about not just the few, but the many who are affected by it, you'll pay a hefty price in the decades that follow.
Thank you. So you can see why I'm excited about this particular panel. Great range of skills, and already some important themes have come out, and there are some obvious follow-on questions, but I'm going to stick to my first question, at least that I promised you. So I want you to start by reflecting a bit on the opportunities that lie in the ARC, the Oxford-Cambridge region, and then what one thing beyond collaboration, because we know that's clearly one of them, but what one thing beyond collaboration do we think, or do you think you really need to put in place to unleash that potential? Andy, let me start with you.
As I was saying to Andy earlier, the advantage of going on a later panel, you can reflect on what everyone else has said as well. So I think from my perspective, I look at it from, so I was AstraZeneca in Cambridge, and we got to the stage of thinking, well, Cambridge isn't big enough for AstraZeneca now. We've got to 4,000 people. And I think that's the starting point is we have Oxford and Cambridge, which have just been found out today again are 1 and 2 global top world leading universities. And that's extraordinary. We just pass it by sometimes. You know, you'd have a look at the globe, and the top 2 universities on the globe are Oxford and Cambridge. They generate huge amounts of intellectual property, huge amounts of ideas, and they've got much better over the years, certainly in Sandy's time, of actually commercialising that and bringing that to fruition. But there's a huge amount there, way more than I would argue that either Oxford or Cambridge can themselves develop and progress. And that if they were to do that, they would have to grow to the size of a Boston. And I actually don't think that is for the benefit of either Oxford or Cambridge, although both may aspire to be a Boston or a West Coast. I think the reality is they're partly successful because of their size. So we know we need those activities to move in a more planful way, so that those benefits can be spread right across, I would call the Oxcam arc. But to John's point as well, it's not just about moving those activities from Oxford and Cambridge into the ARC. It's making sure that Oxford and Cambridge and then the wider Oxcam region are seen as the front window for the rest of the UK. And a phrase I heard this morning, which was said in good intent, I don't like the word spillover. Spillover can also imply breadcrumbs. And my one ask is we need to do this in a planful way, think about what activities, what capabilities, what strengths there are, both across the wider Oxcam arc in places like Cranfield, Bedford, Milton Keynes, but what are the key capabilities and world-leading assets we had across the wider UK so that we can do what you did, Andy. University have mapped their contribution across the wider UK. We need to do that in a more planful way so that full economic benefits don't just apply to Oxford, Cambridge, or even the ARC, that they apply UK-wide.
Can I just say, I 100% agree with you. We, with Experian, had the same problem. It got to a certain size, and we knew we had to really think through a global way forward, a global solution. But one of the things we did very early on with the Midlands Engine was to say, we're not just going to put a plan together for the next 12 months or 2 or 3 years. We've got to look over the horizon. And you heard what the Secretary of State said about some of the energy innovations that are taking place. We've seen it in life sciences, medtech. I think it's really exciting. But we've got to have a vision that stretches decades, multi-party ideally. The engine is non-political, and therefore we'll talk to all the parties, all the players. But if we don't have that vision, which joins up all the dots, then we'll find we'll lose many of the current companies that are already investing in this country and potentially dissuade new investors into this country, wherever we're talking about in the country, from wanting to come here. I agree with you 100%.
Richard, you took the job. You must have seen some potential in this. What's your response?
Well, I'll swap your collaboration for partnership. It's a theme that ran through the morning's sessions. The whole of this thing needs to be greater than the sum of the parts. And I think what that means in practice is the partnership, the staff, its board, and we'll make an exciting announcement tomorrow of the first chair of the Oxford-Cambridge partnership. We've all got to work together to persuade our stakeholders and our partners to, in a sense, put aside some of their parochial interests and look at the bigger picture, where it's not spillover, but it is getting more by collaborating. And what does that mean in practice? Benefits for residents. First and foremost, making a positive impact on our natural environment. That's really fundamental to the partnership's mission. Maximising those opportunities from collaborative R&D and innovation between the HE sector. We have got world-leading universities. We have many universities. I mean, I'm glad Neil Sachdev spoke earlier on, and I think he was the first person in the day to mention Milton Keynes. You're the second. There's lots of good stuff going on in the middle. Yep. Look at Cranfield University as an example. There's some incredible technologies coming out of Cranfield around aerospace, for example. And attracting investment. And if we can persuade the stakeholders across the region to collaborate for that greater good, I think we have a wonderful opportunity, because we have such golden assets across the region to attract the investment required to do the things that will benefit the businesses, all the stakeholders, and the residents of Oxford, Cambridge, and everywhere in between, including Milton Keynes and Bedford.
Great, thank you. Let's broaden it a little bit from just the Oxford-Cambridge economic region to that wider country point, because ultimately, as everyone's been saying, there's something about how these regions help the UK, and you can see it with the Midlands Engine, you can see it with the Northern Powerhouse. The more coherent we can make the narrative around some of those regions, the easier it is to sell the UK story on the international stage, to attract the international inward investment. It also makes it easier to engage with government often. So how do we make sure that we don't end up with, if we overcome the issue of competition, not that there's any competition between certain organisations in the ARC area, but if we overcome that local competition, how do we avoid ending up in the situation where we have the Oxford-Cambridge partnership competing with the Midlands Engine, competing with the Northern Powerhouse? Neil, let me start with you, and then I'm going to come to you, John.
Thank you. Well, that's a great question, actually. And before I go on to that, I just wanted to agree with my colleagues on the right-hand side. And there were some figures actually that I thought were very interesting when I was thinking about the broader UK and particularly the southeast. So the FDI markets report published by the FT in 2023 quoted that London, Oxford and Cambridge From an FDI point of view, we had nearly 600 international projects, and that were foreign direct investments that were using those destinations as the primary market, which then led to about 14,500 jobs. When I looked at that, actually Oxford and Cambridge were pretty low down the list, and that sort of surprised me in terms of the numbers of international inward investment projects. And as I was reflecting on this, some of my colleagues said, well, actually a lot of that growth in Oxford and Cambridge is down to the spin-out activity and growth within as opposed to the international. So I think one answer to your question, Andy, I think is that we need to look at holistically where some of the propositions are for these geographies and make sure that we do have a narrative that talks cohesively to an international marketplace that can, put all of our regions, including the Northern Powerhouse and the Midlands, on a stage where everybody is autonomous in terms of the strengths, but also is very cohesive in terms of a narrative. A bit of an analogy that I'd like to reflect on is, we shouldn't be thinking of ourselves as a beauty contest or the Eurovision Song Contest where we pitch the best for the country. We're more like an Olympic team where there are different capabilities that we excel in, but we cohesively work as a UK team. Now that, to me, is the ideal proposition. How to make that happen, I think, is to have more investment in platforms, neutral sort of bodies that can act for all of these institutions and put forward their capabilities. And certainly MedCity does that for the London region.
Great, thank you. John?
Well, I'm in agreement with you here as well, in that I think what we need is a roadmap. And if you haven't got clarity where all the different stakeholders, all the members of the partnership are aligned and can prioritize things, it's very hard to negotiate with government. And I'll give you some examples of that on road networks. And instead of going forward with 50, 60 separate projects, we started, about 3 years ago, funded by the Treasury, we built an observatory. So we pulled all the data we have available, economic, social, things which would perhaps affect planning decisions on housing, as well as where industrial areas could be developed still further. And we then looked at these road networks to come up with a concept of corridors. So instead of looking at just individual roads, let's have a look at the corridors which are carrying, because in the Midlands we get a ton of freight, and so that's very important. We think that through very carefully. And certainly from a green agenda point of view, it also helps us think through how can we keep traffic, as we look to the future, off the roads, or in some way control the amount of carbon emissions that we are passing through the Midlands on the way to the north or to different parts of the country coming from the ports. So these roadmaps that we pulled together, the corridors, have enabled us then to put propositions forward to government across different departments, but which are brought together. And mayors like Andy Street, for example, is wanting deals so he can say with government, let's agree an overall package deal, and then let it allow me then to implement that. And I have to say to you, I do think the ARC, or whatever you want to describe, I think it's an amazing opportunity. It's got phenomenal potential as you look, again, just look over the horizon 10, 20 years. Two of the best, I think, universities in the world. And not only that, you have other institutions, businesses, all the things that you listed out at the beginning, but you've got to capitalize on it. If you can't implement and deliver on some of these potential initiatives, then you could say we've failed. We've missed that opportunity and not to become the new Victorians. They built a lot of infrastructure. They did a lot of things which kept this country going for over 100 years. It's our turn now to be the new Victorians and invest in that.
Fantastic, thank you. Andy?
So I'll try and be a bit controversial then. I don't think we will all work together. I think we'll be competitive with each other. That is that's naturally the way that people work. And I'm full of a room of property developers and commercial people thinking about their own businesses and how they're going to survive, and they're based in geographies. So we just know that exists. And I think one of my learnings in life is recognize what exists and then what you can put in place to make sure that's managed in a particularly and appropriate way. So what I'm thinking about is One is we've heard narrative, we've heard vision. I think you're right, we need a vision for the country. We need what I would call an authentic narrative. When you are in business, you don't work on political geographies anyway. You work on economic geographies. And economic geographies will go wherever they want to. And that's how you persuade those who are thinking about commercial interests on where to go. Because we'll look at capabilities as a large organisation and where they're based. They don't care where they are in the country. Yeah. And you'll look to build those together. So what we need to do is recognise where we will be competitive with each other. We need to find common cause, and we need, as we found with East West Rail, be driven by the economic opportunity, and that drives the places you go, rather than working the other way around and working where your infrastructure is and then work out where the businesses go. Business needs to drive where the opportunities exist, but it needs to be alongside, as we've talked before, about an authentic narrative. There's no point saying, come and invest in here, because business won't just go and invest somewhere because a politician or a geographically based location has told them to do so. They'll go there if they believe it can provide a differentiated proposition for that organisation.
Andy, if I may, can I give you an example of what I mean by collaboration or partnership or where have you? Grant Shapps talked about West Burton, the Coal Fusion Centre, which a number of ARC universities and Midlands universities are working on together. I share his enthusiasm. I think it's awesome. But it's not just building that. Think of the skills that are needed, the communities, the housing, the transport links that have got to be made. So when I talk about collaboration, it's joining the dots.
Yep.
And if you do that, you can deliver it in 2030 or 35 as opposed to 2050.
Can I there are questions on Slido. Unfortunately, my Slido seems to be stuck on the last session. And I don't want to go back and ask you questions about the government's energy policy. So if you were trying to put a question in Slido and you've got one that you'd want to ask, please do wave and we'll bring a roving mic to you so you can ask them. But it's quite dark out there, so you have to wave quite vigorously.
Or shout quite loud.
Or shout quite loud.
Yes.
Okay, I have Richard, for just building on this discussion, I'll keep an eye on the audience as well for questions, but just building on this discussion, what as you come into this new role, what are the things that you've heard today that excite you most about the opportunity? And what are the things that you would say, well, I'd love to learn a bit more about the way that the Midlands Engines approach this? So what could we learn from John?
Well, two parts to that, really. I mean, one of my, going back to the previous discussion, one of my favourite words, which probably isn't a word, is co-opetition. So there are going to be times where we will want to work together. I mean, just take motorsport, for example. There is a very strong motorsport cluster in our part of the world. You know, they're all interested in future fuels. They're all interested in battery technology. All of our universities are, working hard on R&D in those spaces. So, UK PLC needs to, sell itself where, we're working harmoniously together on those investment opportunities. But equally, we do need to promote our own regions and attract investment, independently as well. One of the things that really struck me about the session this morning, which Barbara Ginelli chaired, was this view that we need to take some risks and we need to accept failure. And I think, perhaps a criticism of the public sector as a generic is it's quite risk averse. But I think we need to develop an appetite for really going for it and taking some risks, being highly innovative, and not just talking about it, but actually trying to deliver some of that. Other things that I've learned from other regions, which I'm sure happen across Oxford, Cambridge and everywhere in between, is the use of demonstrator activities, physical or virtual demonstrator activities where we can engage not just industry and the research clusters in new technology, but we can engage the public in the adoption of new technologies and bring some of those to life and test them out in communities. So, I think there's an awful lot that we can learn from each other. We were talking briefly earlier about some of the wonderful work that goes on in Scotland, particularly in universities like Strathclyde, and how they are helping to sort of fuel and drive the Scottish economy, working collaboratively with the Scottish government. So, lessons from other regions in the UK and of course from abroad.
And I think there's a real appetite interregionally to cooperate, collaborate together there. Life sciences being a good example. Myra, for example,
Yes.
on the transport. It's so obvious. But at the moment, they're all being forgotten because you've got this spider's web all going into the centre, and it's on overload. There has to be another way of driving economic growth for the benefit of all.
I mean, just to be slightly controversial, you know, I think there are things that we can do together as pan-regional partnerships and as clusters to persuade government to go faster on some stuff. So, for example, why has it taken so long to get to the point where we can actually make batteries in the UK? You know, everybody is screaming out for, you know, we've got the technology, we've got the research centres, we've potentially got the investment. You know, why has it taken so long to get to that point when our whole automotive and other supply chains are starting to break down because, you know, we're going to have to import batteries. Now, thankfully, it looks like we found a solution, but it's in your interest, it's in our interest, and it's probably in the interest of every other region in the country to have that capability. So that's how we should work with government on those, you know, nationally significant and important investments. And it may not land in Oxford and Cambridge or the Midlands, and you know, in fact, this one probably won't land in either of our regions, but we're all going to benefit from it.
Yep. I've been rescued with the Slido. There's a question here about, but I'm going to ask in a slightly different way. So the question is actually, why do you think the UK territory mindset strategies is so fragmented when compared to other geographies? I'm actually going to ask you, do you think it is more fragmented than other geographies and countries? Neelam.
Say the question again.
So do you think there's more competition between regions in the UK than in other countries that you're aware of?
Competition within other
Between
countries.
regions within the country, yeah.
Well, it depends on what you're looking at, really. I mean, my personal view is that, well, we've certainly seen a demand for space, for example, demand for infrastructure and real estate. And with the increase in investment coming into the major cities, there is a competition between cities in terms of filling that space, or planning for that space and filling that space. So if you're looking at that, then yes, there is a competition. And is it competitive in other international markets? Yes, I believe it is, but I think the UK is much more mature, and I'm not talking about the US here. If we're talking about science and research, I don't think it is. I think the UK is very collaborative when we're looking at science and research, because that actually drives innovation development. And there are some significant examples where, I mean, we've talked about Oxford, Cambridge and the Midlands. I mean, Oxford, Cambridge, Midlands, London, the North, Scotland has been incredibly active in terms of advanced therapies, for example. So as we know, many of the cell and gene companies are born through spin-out activity, and they grow and they need proximity to clinical space to actually scale. But if you take London as an example, there's very little space for these companies to scale. So what have we done is we've closely worked with Stevenage, for example, for these companies so that they can scale, which means that they stay within the UK, which is actually fundamentally what we want these companies to do. So this is a model example where science has enabled companies to grow and move to a region where there is space. And I think if we look longer term to that trajectory, then competition should diminish. But when you look at just space, then yes, then it becomes competitive.
Yeah. So I think the domains piece is really important. There are different areas. Andy?
I just think, I mean, from my perspective is we've managed to make the UK a lot bigger than it should be by not having the infrastructure needed to connect it to each other. So I see Oxford, Cambridge as a starting point to relate Oxford, Cambridge up to Manchester from a pharmaceutical perspective, because that's where the manufacturing is. I think it's only when people say, well, Oxford, Cambridge is a long way, it couldn't be a cluster. It's just about the same size as the Bay cluster. It's probably slightly further distance-wise than Boston, which is a kind of a little bit more circular. But when Americans come over, and I spend a lot of time looking at Americans, they see UK as quite a small company, and it's only when they try to get anywhere they realise it's a big country. So I think a lot of that competition isn't driven necessarily by a culture of competition, it's driven by a culture of separation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's really, I mean, it's interesting, your point about the relative size. We've done some analysis recently on, in the Cambridge area, Innovate Cambridge, that David Willits mentioned this morning. And one of the things when you look at the data there is we've got cities that are competitive with other leading cities around the world when you control for a per capita basis. But when you remove the per capita figure, you realise how small some of these cities are that we're talking about. And so that connectivity becomes incredibly important. And I think linked to that, the question of then how you make them more porous and get different connections, and the infrastructure becomes essential there. One serious final question and then one less serious one. So I'll do the less serious one first because it's the top voted question. John, would you like to be the next Prime Minister? You don't have to answer that. You did declare you had no interest in politics.
I have no interest in politics. I have a lot of interest in my country, and I do think at this moment in time, it's incumbent on us all to want to be agents of change, doing things, working together to make a difference. And that's my ambition.
Thank you. So my slightly more serious question. We're going to do this conference again on a regular basis, I'm sure, but let's say we're here in 5 years' time. What do you hope will be different about the conversation in 5 years' time? And I'm going to start with you, Sir John, and come this way.
I think we're at an inflection point, and I'm seriously very worried about that inflection point. The world has not stood still over COVID, and Asia particularly is going from strength to strength. Those nations which sell oil and gas, they're getting wealthier. India's GDP this year is going to grow by 6-7%. So you can't ask that question in isolation of what else is happening around the world. And why I think we're at an inflection point, we have to decide whether or not we want to tackle some of these very, very challenging issues around skills, around connectivity. You know, east-west connectivity in this country is dire. But you know, what we have at the moment is a system of government where, and I don't know how many council leaders are in this audience here, but they are being pitted against each other on funds which they have to bid for. And there are far more losers than there are winners. Is that really a way to run the country? I do think we have got to make a choice in terms of what kind of industries, what kind of universities, what kind of skills, training. We need to make some very high-level decisions around these clusters and then have roadmaps to deliver it, taking not just a 2 or 3 year view. 5 years is a short period of time, but what are we going to do for the next 10, 20, 30 years?
Thank you. Neela, let me come to you.
What I'd like to see in 5 years' time. So I don't think we spent much time talking about social inclusivity and how collaboration and clusters can work together with our communities to improve health outcomes. Yep. And I think that's fundamental in terms of what we're all trying to do in accelerating innovation. So in 5 years' time, I'd love to see the Oxford-Cambridge ARC as well as the UK as a whole, really involving communities, using innovation to bring research out to the communities fundamentally to innovate and improve outcomes. And that's particularly important in terms of clinical trials and using technologies to decentralize trials, which actually means that we are much more able to connect up clusters because we're using technology to do that.
Great. Andy?
So I'm going to use Verk to Science Geek, having not been a scientist for the last 15 years. The amount of innovation coming through in life sciences at the moment is enormous, and I suspect it's translating to other sectors. I'm surprised that we've become less innovative, we heard this afternoon, rather than more innovative. So I guess for me, I see that innovation, John. That's my hope, that in 5 years' time, we're talking about innovation across a much wider geography and a more inclusive geography than we have at the moment. If you'd asked me this question last year, I would have been a pessimist. I think the last 12 months has shown how quickly you can make a change.
Absolutely.
So if we can make that change and continue to make that change, then I think we should be living in hope.
Well, you've seen what we've done in the Midlands and life sciences by focusing on it as a major opportunity. And I'm putting a huge amount of my time into this cold fusion, this energy area. We want to create a megawatt valley because if we're going to power advanced manufacturing, We've got to have that infrastructure.
I know we're running out of time. I'll just say, this time last year, when everything was quite negative, one of the strongest supporters, funnily enough, of the Oxcam Arc was John. And I met him up in Leeds because he could see the benefit of the Oxcam Arc, the Midlands engine. And it's that hope that we should build on, people who want to collaborate, want to work together, and want to find a better way.
Richard, let me give you a final word.
I'd like us to talk a bit more about the environment and environmental development and sustainability. And in 5 years' time, I would hope that we're talking about environmental development and economic development hand in glove. It's the same agenda with common aims and outcomes for our businesses, for our universities, for our communities and for society.
Thank you all. Please join me in thanking a fantastic panel.